In the world of Game of Thrones, Jaime Lannister's slaying of the Mad King stands as one of the most defining moments in Westerosi history. This act branded him as the Kingslayer, a label that has haunted Jaime throughout his life. But what if Jaime had never killed the Mad King? How would this single change in history have shaped the fate of the Seven Kingdoms, House Lannister, and even the eventual rise of Daenerys Targaryen? In this video, we'll dive deep into this alternate timeline, exploring the ripple effects of Jaime's inaction on key events and characters. Jaime Lannister's fateful decision to kill the Mad King took place during Robert's Rebellion. As a member of the Kingsguard, Jaime was sworn to protect the king, but he faced a dire moral dilemma. Aerys had ordered the destruction of King's Landing using wildfire, intending to burn the city rather than surrender it to Robert Baratheon's forces. With the help of his pyromancers, Aerys had stockpiled wildfire beneath the city, and his order was to burn them all. Jaime, knowing the devastation this would cause and the deaths of countless innocents, took it upon himself to strike down the king. This act not only saved King's Landing from a fiery death, but also ensured the fall of House Targaryen. Robert Baratheon would ascend to the throne, marking the end of Targaryen rule after nearly 300 years. Despite the noble intentions behind his actions, Jaime earned the scorn of the realm. Killing the king, even a mad one, was seen as the ultimate betrayal of his oaths. Thus, Jaime was forever known as the Kingslayer, a dishonorable title that eclipsed his heroism. His reputation suffered, and so did his relationships with those who couldn't understand the truth behind his actions, most notably Ned Stark, who witnessed the aftermath. In the original story, Jaime's decision indirectly enabled Robert's rebellion to succeed, and brought about significant changes in the political landscape. The Lannisters gained prominence, leading Tywin to orchestrate the eventual marriage between Robert and Cersei Lannister. Jaime's identity and inner turmoil became intertwined with his choice, impacting his character development throughout the series. This key event set the tone for the future of Westeros. But what if Jaime had chosen a different path? What if he had stayed loyal to Aerys II and allowed the Mad King to carry out his plans? In the next section, we'll explore how the kingdom might have been shaped had Jaime never raised his sword against Aerys. Had Jaime Lannister never killed the Mad King's final order to burn them all would likely have been carried out. The pyromancers, loyal to him, would have unleashed wildfire beneath the streets of King's Landing. The city would have been engulfed in flames, killing not only its inhabitants, but also the invading Baratheon forces, who were on the verge of victory. The destruction of King's Landing would have been catastrophic. Robert Baratheon, Ned Stark, and Stannis Baratheon, key figures in the rebellion, might have perished in the wildfire, leading to a collapse of the rebel forces. Without their leaders, the rebellion would have lost its momentum, leaving the Targaryens still in power. Tywin Lannister, who had just turned against the crown by sacking King's Landing, would have been caught in a precarious position. He might have sought a way to distance himself from the Targaryens, or solidify his hold through manipulation. In this alternate story, Robert's rebellion likely fails, or at least ends in a stalemate. With King's Landing destroyed, the Targaryen rule could persist, but the loss of the capital would leave the Mad King and his family vulnerable. The rebellion might splinter into smaller conflicts, with different houses vying for control of the ruined capital and other regions. Additionally, the aftermath of King's Landing's destruction would change the political landscape of Westeros. Major houses like the Starks and Baratheons would suffer tremendous losses, weakening their influence. The Lannisters, having initially backed the Mad King, might attempt to reclaim favor with the remaining Targaryens, but they would face fierce opposition from those who survived. The destruction of the city would also create a power vacuum, leaving room for new players to emerge. The Ironborn, for example, could see the chaos as an opportunity to raid and expand their territories. Dorne might reconsider its neutral stance and attempt to seize control of regions left vulnerable by the chaos. Without Jaime's intervention, King Aerys would have lived long enough to see his ultimate vengeance against the Baratheon-led forces. However, this act of mass destruction would have alienated many of the Targaryens' remaining supporters. The Loyalist faction, already dwindling, might have turned against Aerys after witnessing his madness manifest so destructively. Viserys and Daenerys, his surviving children, would still be in a precarious position. While Aerys remained on the throne, his reign would be on shaky ground. The destruction of King's Landing would cast doubt on his ability to rule, even among the most steadfast Targaryen loyalists. It's possible that factions within the Targaryen camp could plot to remove Aerys, viewing his actions as a threat to the dynasty's future. A rebellion within the ranks of Targaryen supporters might arise, with loyalists seeking to replace Aerys with a more stable leader. Viserys and Daenerys, still young at this point, would remain in the shadow of the larger political players. Without the need to flee into exile, their futures would be more tightly connected to the political developments in Westeros. Daenerys, in particular, would not grow up in Essos, and her journey to reclaim her family's throne might never happen. The Targaryen dynasty's survival would depend on how well they could recover from the devastation Aerys caused. The loyalty of the remaining great houses, such as the Martells and Tyrells, would be tested as they reconsidered their allegiance to a house that had just destroyed its own capital. Without the Kingslayer title hanging over his head, Jaime Lannister's life would unfold quite differently. His reputation as a member of the Kingsguard would remain intact, and he would continue to be seen as a loyal servant of the crown. However, his inner conflict over watching King Aerys carry out such a horrific act might weigh heavily on him, perhaps even more so than the guilt he carries in the original story. Jaime's relationship with other key characters, particularly Ned Stark, would shift significantly. In the original story, Ned views Jaime as dishonorable for betraying his oath to protect the king, but in this alternate scenario, Jaime remains true to his vows, even as King's Landing burns. Ned might respect Jaime for his loyalty, though he would likely despise him for allowing the massacre. This dynamic would give Jaime a different reputation among the noble houses of Westeros. Jaime's relationship with his father Tywin Lannister could also take an interesting turn. Tywin, pragmatic as ever, might have viewed Jaime's decision to spare the Mad King as a strategic failure. Jaime's inaction could tarnish the Lannisters' bid for power, especially if Tywin's betrayal of Aerys becomes public knowledge after the destruction of King's Landing. Jaime, who always sought his father's approval, might become further alienated from Tywin as a result. On a personal level, Jaime might become more conflicted and broken, having failed to prevent a catastrophe. The weight of his oath, his loyalty to a Mad King, and the consequences of that loyalty could haunt him for the rest of his life. But his legacy would be stained by the inaction that led to the destruction of King's Landing. Without the burden of being the Kingslayer, Jaime's arc as a character might follow a different path. He could remain more aligned with Cersei, and less inclined to undergo the character growth we see in the original story. His desire to protect his family and preserve the Lannister name might become even more central to his identity. If Jaime never killed the king, the Lannisters' political power might be significantly diminished. Tywin Lannister, who orchestrated the sack of King's Landing, would face severe repercussions from the remaining Targaryen supporters. In the original story, Tywin's betrayal of Aerys was somewhat excused because of Jaime's killing of the king, which ensured a smoother transition to Robert's rule. Without this, Tywin's position would be far more precarious. The Lannisters would no longer enjoy the favor of the ruling house, leaving them vulnerable to retribution from loyalists who supported the Targaryens. If the Targaryens retain power, Tywin's ambitions to marry Cersei to Robert Baratheon, or another powerful figure, would be derailed. The Lannisters could lose their grip on the Iron Throne and their influence over the kingdom. In this alternate scenario, Tywin might attempt to distance himself from the actions of his family, or he could try to manipulate the chaos to his advantage. Without the stability provided by Jaime's decisive action in the original story, the Lannisters would have to rely on their wealth and cunning to maintain their influence in the shifting political landscape of Westeros. Cersei's marriage prospects might change, as she would no longer be aligned with Robert Baratheon's newly established rule. The Lannisters, without a solid alliance to secure their position, could become politically isolated. Their role as one of the great houses of Westeros would be challenged, forcing them to find new avenues to regain their influence. As the political landscape continues to shift, the Lannisters might still play a significant role in Westeros, but it would be from a far weaker position. Tywin, always a master strategist, could still find a way to keep his family in power. But without Jaime's fateful decision, their rise to dominance would be far from certain. If Jaime Lannister had not killed Aerys II, the legacy of the Mad King would have taken on an even darker tone in Westerosi history. Aerys' madness, already infamous, would become synonymous with destruction and the reckless endangerment of the entire realm. Aerys' legacy would cast a long shadow over the Targaryen dynasty. Future rulers from House Targaryen would likely struggle to escape the taint of his final act. Even if Daenerys or another family member were to take the throne, their rule would be marred by the memory of Aerys' madness. Furthermore, the destruction of King's Landing would have significant cultural ramifications. The capital of the Seven Kingdoms is not only the political center, but also a hub of history, knowledge, and culture. Its fiery demise would be remembered as one of the greatest tragedies in the realm's history, creating a lasting sense of loss among the surviving lords and small folk alike. Stories of the Mad King's rampage would become legend, passed down for generations as a cautionary tale. This tarnished legacy would also impact House Targaryen's reputation in the wider world. In Essos, where the Targaryens originally came from, the destruction of King's Landing would likely cause fear and mistrust of the remaining members of the family. Essosi rulers and merchant lords might reconsider their alliances with the Targaryens, seeing them as dangerous liabilities rather than powerful allies. Finally, Arryn's infamous last act would serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute monarchy in Westeros. The Lords of the Seven Kingdoms might push for greater checks on royal power, seeking to limit the ability of future monarchs to act with impunity. Arryn's reign would become a symbol of the need for reform, potentially influencing the political structure of Westeros for years to come. The choice Jaime Lannister made to kill the Mad King was one of the most pivotal moments in Westerosi history, setting the stage for the political and personal conflicts that followed. Had Jaime not acted, King's Landing would have been reduced to ash, and the rebellion might have ended in failure or prolonged chaos. The survival of the Targaryens, the potential collapse of the rebellion, and the shifting roles of characters like Jaime and Tywin would have reshaped the future of Westeros in ways that are both fascinating and tragic. Jaime's act of regicide, while reviled, ultimately saved countless lives and shaped the world of Game of Thrones as we know it. In this alternate timeline, however, we see how the cost of loyalty and inaction might have led to even greater devastation.